Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by Akhil Jalan, a third-year computer science PhD student at UT Austin. He works for the Cultivated Meat Modelling Consortium, where he looks at the computational biology of alternative proteins as part of his PhD. His research involves the usage of AI and machine learning computational models to help scale up cultivated meat by making it more affordable and likely to one day replace conventional meat. So, Akhil, can you start us off by telling us how computational modeling for cultivated meat actually works for someone who's completely new to the space? What is a model? How do you go about making one?
Sure. Yeah. So computational modeling is a very broad and diverse area. It can refer to all sorts of different things. Generally, the goal of a model is to be able to understand some complicated system so that you can either study it in more detail, or if you want to control the system and steer it towards a certain outcome. So at CMMC, the typical systems that we're interested in are bioreactor systems. So in a bioreactor, you have a large tank or vessel. It's similar to a beer brewing tank, if you've seen that before. And these tanks are filled with a fluid called a medium, which is what cells eat to grow and multiply. And they're filled with cells. So in these systems, you do what's called a cell culture, which is where you grow and multiply cells in vitro. And the goal of a model is to understand what is happening inside of the bioreactor, because there are millions and billions of cells. Some of them are alive, some of them are dying, some of them are multiplying, some of them are stagnant. There's varying levels of input and output from those cells. So they might be consuming metabolites like glucose and then excreting waste products like lactic acid. And then finally, there's the sort of fluid dynamics aspect, which is that the tank isn't just sitting still, it's actually mixing in order to distribute those nutrients throughout the tank evenly. So in a computational model, we try to track all the different aspects of that system so that we can understand what is happening inside the system, and then hopefully to make better design choices to grow the cells faster, more efficiently, more cheaply.
Yeah, and how do you decide exactly what the problem it is that you want to model to solve? By that I mean, how do you know if you're supposed to look at like cell adhesion or proliferation in order to like maximize the yield of cells?
Right, so that's a choice. There isn't one right answer, and it depends on what your focus is at that moment in time. So, for example, you mentioned cell adhesion, right? Cell adhesion itself is a very complicated process, and so you could write several papers just studying that. On the other hand, in a huge system like a 5,000 liter bioreactor, if you tried to model cells at the level of adhesion, then it would just be computationally infeasible. So there are certain trade-offs you have to make when designing the model. And I guess the things that you want to balance are computational speed. So it has to run reasonably fast. You have to balance accuracy, obviously. Although, like I said, the accuracy depends on the particular prediction you're making or the question you're asking. Um, and maybe interpretability, I would say. So more complex models, like a deep learning model, for example, might actually perform better on certain accuracy measures. But if you don't understand why they're making the predictions they are, then it's not necessarily helpful.
Yeah, so you talked about the different types of things you're modeling. So you're modeling at the bioreactor level, and then also there are some models that try to do it at the cellular level. So could you tell me what the difference between scale up and scale down models are?
Yeah, sure. So scale up and scale down are aptly named. Scale up refers to a model where you're trying to take a process that's understood at a smaller scale and then model it at a larger scale. So maybe transferring from a well plate, which is under 1 liter of medium, up to a like 1,000 liter bioreactor. And then scale down is the opposite. It's where you have a large system, but you actually want to model it at a smaller scale. So scale up, I think, it's more intuitive why you would want to do that. For scale down, the reason is to isolate particular aspects of the system. So again, going back to cell adhesion, it's a good example, right? Let's say I have a hypothesis that, the um, the rotor speed of a stirred tank bioreactor will inhibit cell adhesion, which is important for their growth. Well, if you're tracking the growth of billions and billions of cells, then it's very difficult to model that efficiently on a computer. But if you do a scale down experiment, then you can maybe model a 100 milliliter bioreactor and then test that hypothesis within the same computational model. And so that scale down experiment would help answer that question. And then based on the answer to that question, you can then build an assumption into the larger model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm just curious to know what happens in the absence of computational modeling. So what do companies do instead? Are they like mainly physical experiments that they conduct?
Yeah, so I couldn't really tell you because I've only ever worked on the computational side. So I imagine that there is a lot of physical experimentation that goes on. And I mean, ultimately, I think that there isn't a sharp dichotomy between computational and non-computational. I think it's just about the level of detail that your model involves. So, for example, there have been techno-economic analyses of cultivated meat that have been published, which essentially do certain calculations in like Excel, right? I would consider that a computational model because you're still making certain precise predictions on the basis of some kind of data or some kind of math. But it's not a super complex model. So I imagine that at least that level of modeling happens at every, large scale bioprocess facility, but I wouldn't know for sure.
That makes sense. And are there any like other unique advantages that computational models might offer? Is it that they could be like cheaper potentially or like much quicker
As opposed to what?
as opposed to like the physical experiments that people run?
Yes. So computational models, like you said, are both cheaper and faster. And I think because of that, you can explore a lot more hypotheses rapidly. I think a third benefit that is not as widely acknowledged is that computational models are more replicable and interpretable than physical experiments. So, a model is a reusable abstraction of a process. And the model is not necessarily accurate to reality, but it allows you to essentially isolate certain aspects of the system that you believe that you understand, and then to test that under a wide variety of conditions. So in a physical experiment, you might need 50 or 100 or 1,000 replicates to even isolate a single, process variable. Whereas in a computational model, it's kind of just giving you what you put in. So you have an assumption, and then of course that assumption manifests in the outcome of the model. But the benefit of that is that you can still sort of do the same experimental process, and you can completely understand what caused the outcome that you saw, which isn't the case in physical experiments.
Yeah. And now one of the challenges with using computational models in the cellular agriculture space is that we just don't have enough data. Not enough experiments have been run in the past regarding, I'm sure, some of the types of things that you're testing for, like the breaking point of a cell. Maybe we've only looked at like maybe this, and this has led to an increase in the rate of growth, but we've never tested it till its limits. So do you think that this lack of data constrains the models that you make?
I mean, absolutely, yes. And I think that a large part of the motivation for my PhD research is tackling this question of data-driven modeling in the small data regime. So I think I published an article with the CMMC a while back on, I think it was called something like a small data approach
Yeah.
to cellular agriculture. And so that gets at exactly the question you're asking, which is how do you do modeling in the presence of little to no data? So the old school approach is to use first principles mechanistic models. So, for example, fluid dynamics is not a data-driven model, right? Fluid dynamics equations are understood. We know what they are. We know you can put in your process variables and then it'll run a model for you. So that requires no data. In systems biology, those models are still very nascent. And so there's not as much understanding of the governing equations of, let's say, cellular adhesion. Um, so it takes a lot of work, but basically, if you zoom out, I would argue that there are tools from statistics like active learning, transfer learning, which can tackle these problems. It just requires a new toolbox.
Mm. And for these small data models, you would need to do continuous learning, right? Where you would have to like verify the models with an experiment that you're running. So do you think that it is possible to eliminate the need for physical experiments if we still have to run them along the side to like verify the accuracy of the model?
Well, I think that uh, no, I mean not in the near future, at least.
Mm.
Um, I think that there's a spectrum again, right? So at the end of the day, physical experiments are all that matter because that's the real world. That's what really matters. I can't imagine a scenario where you could make a critical decision at scale without some sort of data. Um, because like I said, with models, what you get out is what you put in. And so when we talk about like continuous learning, that's a matter of leveraging more intelligently the data that we do have and making more careful and targeted decisions about what experiments we want to run. For example, like certain scale down experiments. But I definitely would not say that you can ever replace data until you get to a point maybe where you've been studying a process and running it successfully for like years and years, and you just know exactly how all of it works, and crucially, you're doing nothing new. So if you're just doing the same thing over and over, I think at some point you have enough data, but you needed that data to get there.
Mm. And are there things that we can do to make sure that our cellular agriculture models are accurate? Like often there are parameters that we haven't looked into or just data we don't have yet, assumptions we make. So are there things you test for or just like try to preempt?
Um, I mean, I think sure, but I guess like I don't have anything especially unique to say about that. I mean, one thing I would say as well is like, I guess with modeling, people often think that like the best approach is to maybe just model every single detail you possibly can. So, you model at the subcellular level and at the cellular level and at the microcarrier level and at the bioreactor level. And you sort of fuse all these together into like one huge model. And I think that that isn't really necessary or even productive until you've sort of really nailed down each of those components super well. And even then, it's like not the most efficient use of your time. So I think that when we're trying to validate our models, it's really important to ask, what are we trying to achieve? What do we want to use the model for? And I think that people who say we want to understand everything that's happening inside the system are asking for too much in a way. I think it's much more important to just look at outcomes. So do we have good yield? Do we have good proliferation, survival rates, and mass transfer? Um, and that's all I am personally focused on too.
And to follow up on this, there are just things that we can't model, right? We can't go all the way down to the cellular level when we don't have enough expertise, or even there are like some bioreactors that we don't have enough information about, right? So is it like really difficult to model those things?
Well, sure, some things are more difficult than others, but like I don't think like cellular agriculture is building off of like research in systems biology and physics that's been done for a long time. So I think any particular aspect of the system that you want to model, there's going to be literature there. Um, I mean unless you have something specific in mind, I don't think that there's something where we just like have we're sort of shooting in the dark completely.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this is regarding the inputs of the model itself, right? Could you talk a little bit about network reduction and whether that's something that's important to use when constructing like computational biology models?
What's the network reduction?
So based off of what I've read, it's like basically there are a bunch of nodes and you basically like join them together when you see like a similar outcome and then you proceed. It's like a way to simplify the data as you go along. I think that's used to make sure that the computational models run quicker. And I wanted to
I'm
know
not
if that's something you know.
sure. I'm not
Okay.
sure what that is. I mean, what kind of network are you modeling? Is it like a metabolic network, gene regulatory network? Like what?
Yeah, I'm not really sure about like what exactly it is that you're modeling, but I've just read like up on some of the things that they're trying to do to just improve like some of the speed of the model. And I just thought that like this could be something that's happening. But yeah, that was just something that I had. My next question is about like the data itself that you collect. How do you improve the robustness of the data that you collect for the data sets?
I think you'd have to ask my colleagues on the experimental side. I don't really know. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I try to be aware of like, sensor drift, for example, or problems like that. But I don't know what I think probably every field has its own standards.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a question about like academia in general. And one of the big issues is just not replicating enough experiments because no one's incentivized to go beyond the peer review process. And I'm sure that that might also have some implications for alternative proteins as well. Do you think there are ways to like incentivize people to, replicate research to make sure that, we can verify some of the experiments that people done?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question, and I don't know if I have a good answer. I think
Mhm.
uh, I guess the way I view it is that academia and industry have different goals. So academia is in a way more about pure science and about discovering new concepts and ideas and sort of pushing the envelope. And then industry takes those fundamental discoveries and then tries to really apply them to real problems. Um, so I think that one thing that we can do concretely, which people are doing, is ensuring more knowledge sharing and more cooperation among industry. There are many initiatives that are doing that. I mean, CMMC is doing that, right? The whole point of the CMMC is to create knowledge sharing in terms of computational modeling, so that rather than every company developing its own in-house modeling, they go to the CMMC, they have this sort of IP structure, and then that saves everyone time and effort. Um, GFI is doing a lot of work along those lines. I know New Harvest has some kind of open cell ag initiative. So I think that um, it's probably, I mean, definitely there are academics who are also trying to address this problem, but academia is just a huge system. It's like thousands and thousands of universities and researchers and stuff across the world. So I think that kind of thing will take many decades to shift.
Yeah, and do you have like a number for like how many companies are part of CMMC? Like, is
I
there
don't
like
know.
you don't know? Okay.
I don't know that data.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to now move on to cultivated meat itself. What do you think is one of the biggest bottlenecks in the entire industry?
Uh, I mean, I can't really like sort of give. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, right? Because I'm a researcher, so I'm sort of focused on specific technical problems. I think that again, like people like Elliot Swartz at GFI have done a lot of like big picture work on the problem. So I would refer you to them. I can definitely tell you that scale up is a massive problem. And I don't know if that's a bottleneck per se. I mean, I think, it's just a young industry, and so it's in the process of scaling up. But I mean, I can't really say with confidence beyond that.
Yeah, so just referencing the techno economic paper you were talking about, I think that David Humbred wrote. One of the big issues is also just the high capital costs involved in cultivated meat and that making it unaffordable. So even if we're able to, through these computational models, like be able to
Mhm.
reduce R&D costs because we're making it so much easier for them to carry out some of these experiments, there could also be
Mhm.
that concern that like prices are going to still be too high. So that's just a thought that I had in mind regarding this. Yeah.
Mhm.
How much does it usually cost to like make a model? Because I'm sure that like it probably costs a lot of money to make run a physical experiment, but like how much do you
Mhm.
think it may cost?
To make a model?
Yeah.
I mean, essentially nothing beyond the researcher's time. So, I mean, we all have computers, right? Um, Sometimes for certain models you need, a lot of compute, but not like supercomputer level, just like having a GPU machine. I think like an NVIDIA GPU desktop machine costs like, I don't know, something on the order of $3,000 to $5,000. Um, and then, I mean, beyond that, just whatever the time of the researchers is. So like if you have like a team of four, maybe you're paying them, which by the way, I don't think that there's a single company in the world that has a team of four researchers dedicated to just computational modeling. But if you did, it would cost, maybe on the order of 300, $400,000 if they all were experts for a year. So yeah, like that's it. And again, that's like a level of investment that's like far beyond what I think anyone is doing at the moment within this space. I mean, I can tell you definitely the CMMC is not paying even a fraction of that to their paid uh, staff.
And I'd imagine that like that's much less expensive than some of the other things that currently go on in the industry. So are there any other areas that computational models could be used to like help animal welfare? So currently you do work in like alternative proteins in the space of cultivated meat, but do you see that help like working out in like plant-based meat or fermented meat?
Yeah, so computational models are definitely critical to all three pillars of alternative proteins. I mean, so actually, I think the most success for computational modeling has been in precision fermentation, and it's just that that work has sort of been done under the name of chemical engineering, and so people haven't really thought of it as computational per se, but like it's completely essential to how precision fermentation operates at scale. And there are plenty of people, like, I mean, I can tell you, like, for example, Chaz Haringa is like an academic who's written a lot of good papers on combining CFD with precision fermentation. Um, in general, there's a sort of focus on process analytical technology. With plant-based, I'm not sure because I've never worked on it directly, but from conversations with colleagues, I think that there are definitely opportunities there as well. So, for example, in analysis and modeling of extrusion processes like low moisture and high moisture extrusion, or in analysis of texturization and scaffolding, which are all important. Then there's the sort of pure data science type questions, which I mean, I vaguely remember. There's some, like sort of there's a broad search space of like ingredients, colorants, etc. And so there's this sort of like optimization that's going on there. I think Notco is like an example of a company that's filed patents to use machine learning in plant-based products. Um, so I think that the effort to bring like statistics and computation is very nascent still, and I think that there's potential for a huge impact. There's also, I mean, just work you can do on the marketing side or on the sort of finance side, which I think is often underappreciated. Like I think Synonym Bio, for example, has done good work in that vein. Um, yeah, and then of course in Cultivated, I mean, there's tons of work on using computation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure that like we've all learned a lot about just what these models look like and what kind of impact that they might actually have for the alternative protein space. So I want to now move on to some of the more like questions about you. So what got you interested to work in animal welfare? I know that like with the talent you have, you could have ended up in AI research, but what stood out about animal welfare?
Well, I think it's a very high impact area to work on. I mean, for me, my motivation is just to, do what I can to improve the world, to contribute to efforts to do good. And I think that alt proteins are a very unambiguously important and very neglected area. So I definitely have looked into other areas and topics. I mean, if you look at my CV, it is sort of pretty broad. I mean, I've worked on many problems, in the past, but for now, at least, I think that alt proteins are a really, really solid and important area to work on.
Mm.
Yeah.
And could you elaborate more upon like work that you'll be doing this summer. I hear that there is exciting stuff in like scaling up cultivated meat that you're doing for ARC Biotech.
Yeah. So I mean, I haven't started with them. So I can't really say much, but yeah, I mean, they're a company that makes bioreactors, and they are doing a lot of great work on both the hardware and the software side. And so I'll be, working more on the software side, using some of these ideas in modeling, data science, and so on. And I think ARC even had like a technical blog they wrote about something along the lines of using computation to speed up process development. And so that's very much in line with what I'm interested in and want to do with them.
Yeah. And do you have any advice for people who might want to work in computational modeling? What do they have to learn, and is it difficult?
Mhm. I guess I would say, it's there's definitely room in the industry for people with all sorts of backgrounds and skill sets. So I would say just, follow what you really are excited about and passionate about and love doing, because you will succeed more in that than if you try to force yourself into studying some other topics. So as far as someone who would want to go into computation specifically, I mean, I could say concretely that like it's, I mean, my background is in applied math, and I think that that's really benefited me over the years because it's a very broad and flexible framework that is used throughout the sciences. So I would definitely advise, let's say students like yourself to do a lot of math, maybe even consider minoring or majoring in math in college. And then beyond that, to just, I guess not necessarily overcorrect for their interests based on what they see happening in the industry right now, because it's a very young industry and it's still figuring itself out, getting its legs. And so, there are plenty of companies who are taking very interesting and, innovative approaches to the problem, but it's by no means solved. So if you think that you have some different approach which might work better, don't be afraid to pursue that as well.
And do you have like, okay, so I want to ask you a question about like alternative proteins, and like it's just a question about, do you think that it will one day be able to displace conventional meat, and do you have like a timeline in mind?
I don't have a timeline, and I don't know if it'll ever displace conventional meat. But I think that it certainly has potential. I mean, I think so. If you look at plant-based milks, that's a more sort of mature and widespread industry, and I think it accounts for something like 10% of sales in North America and Europe. So I think I mean, 10% is huge. I think I'd be very happy with that outcome. And of course, more is better, but I really can't say because it's food is bound up not just in, technology and climate, but also in like culture and tradition. And so that's something that's pretty hard to predict. And I don't, I mean, I just don't know, but I think certainly it has a lot of promise.
Yep. Are there any thoughts that you'd like to leave us with that we haven't covered so far?
No, I don't think so. I think you really hit a lot of good stuff. So thank you, Karthik.
Okay. Thank you so much, Akhil, for joining us today. I must say that as someone who doesn't know much about biology or computational modeling, I certainly learned a great deal about how it works. And I'm sure that our viewers also feel the same way. And your work will go a very long way in helping animals. And I'm just honored to have had the chance to discuss it with you.
All right. Thank you.